fruit trees are one thing, but also fruiting shrubs. Probably as a home gardener, fruiting shrubs are probably the most cost-effective way to add to the food that you're putting into your larder, and yet they take little room in your garden and they don't demand a lot from you in terms of work or even sprays or anything like that. So if you are staying away from all that, they are perfect for that purpose. We're going to talk about small fruits. We're also going to talk about flowering shrubs and small trees. So little leaf linden, you know, the same rules that apply to the way a fruit tree grows also apply to all those other trees. The only things that are not going to be covered are evergreens, because that's a whole different group of plants. They have a different way of growing. So we will be talking about pruning fundamentals. Why do we prune? You know, what's the point of doing it if you don't know why you're doing it? What drives plant growth? So how does a plant grow so that you have to come in and cut some of it out? When do you prune? Now, we've always thought that you do it in the winter because, you know, the fruit growers do it then. Well, guess what? I'm here to change your mind on that. Plant physiology, how it grows. So this is something where what we have learned in the last 50 years is being incorporated now into how we prune. And it's about time, because the old methods of pruning didn't work very well because they didn't take that into account. And we have a whole lot of trees that are really messy out there. So how many of you have got those big old open center trees? You know, they look nice and big and gnarly and artistic. They might even grow a whole lot of fruit. But you know what? There's very little of those trees that are actually productive. It's all on the outside. And usually it means having to get up on a ladder. So there are better ways to do it. And if you have one of those or a whole bunch of those, I hate to say it, but sometimes it's better just to kill pruning by Husqvarna and then plant some new ones. If you do want to maintain them, you can talk to us later. And because I'll be giving you all kinds of strategies, but I won't be addressing that particularly. Now, in plant physiology, the two things that we have to know about are apical dominance. If you've never heard that before, I'm sure you've experienced it, and I'll show you how. And also plant hormones. And don't worry, there's not a whole lot of them. You know, they don't get PMS or anything like that, so you don't have to worry about that aspect. There are two that you have to know about, and they're important. There are different types of pruning cuts. Not a whole lot, but two that are really important. One is what you want to use, the other one is you use sparingly. And then there are the tools, and like you've already seen, we have a coupon. If you need some new tools, then you might want to take a look at the tools. There are two fruit tree pruning systems that I'd like to talk to you about. I put the information for that at the very end of my presentation, so if some of you have got you know, that's not what you're interested in, then, and we're getting a little close to time, then you can skedaddle. You don't have to worry about sticking around. And then we'll do a recap at the end, okay? So, first off, why do we prune fruit trees and fruiting shrubs? We want to improve the fruit quality. I mean, you can cut it back, but if it's not going to make an improvement on the fruit, which is why we're growing them, what's the point? We also want to increase the fruit size. So if you have a lot of fruit on your tree, and you know, I mean, eating a peanut-sized apple is not the most pleasant experience. It's mostly core. So we want something that's a little bit bigger. We want to improve light penetration, because light penetration and air penetration cuts down on the amount of disease, and it also increases your fruit bud production, better fruit set and growth, increases the soluble sugars, and enhances the color. And you may wonder why all of that is important, but as a commercial fruit grower, I can tell you that was really important. If you had lots of sugars in your fruit, the fruit lasted longer. It kept better. People like to eat it more. And if the enhanced color, you know, with apples particularly, which is what we grew predominantly, it's all about color. You know, when it goes over the grading, you've got to have X amount red blush for particular varieties for it to count as a grade A. Otherwise it'll be C, and believe me, there's a big difference between those two grades in terms of the kind of money you get back. So, you know, might not be as important for you, but still knowing how to get that light penetration will give you this as a side benefit. It improves pest and disease control, and for a lot of you, it's about controlling plant size. So this is where there could be a bit of a problem, especially with fruit trees. Because if you have older fruit trees, chances are they're on a standard rootstock. So if you want to have an apple tree, it has to be grafted onto a rootstock. If you grow it from seed, it will have characteristics of both parents, but if one parent was a Macintosh and the other one was a Gala, it will not be either one. It's like your kids, right? You need cross-pollination, so you have a male and a female, and what you end up with might be a lot like you or your partner, but it's not exactly the same. So this is what's happening with fruit trees too, because you need cross-pollination. Not for every type of fruit, but for apples in particular. Pears, you're better usually with a cross-pollinator, and some of the sweet cherries need a cross-pollinator, particularly the older varieties like the Bings and the Vans. The new ones, wonderful, are self-pollinating. It makes a big difference. Because they're on a standard rootstock, and because trees of any kind are genetically predetermined to grow to a certain height, it doesn't matter how much you prune it. If it's going to grow to 20 feet high, you can cut it back all you want, and it is still determined to get to be 20 feet, 25 feet high. So, you know, sometimes it's a matter of who's going to win, the tree or you know, because that's just the way things are. But when they are grafted, because the horticulture industry has been grafting fruit trees for many years, they're putting them onto rootstocks that will actually dwarf them. So you can get fruit trees now that are going to stay within a certain limit. And believe me, it makes a huge difference in terms of how big the plant is going to get. But that also means when you plant them, just to show you right here, okay, oh, thankfully I used a small pot. All right, don't know if you can see it really well, but there's a bit of a dog leg right here. This down below is the root. Above this knob, which is where the graft occurred, this is the variety that we actually want to grow. Okay, now remember what I said about seedlings, right? They're going to have characteristics of the parents, but if you want to grow a particular variety, it has to be grafted. So this is a Cox's orange pippin, and you know, that was an apple discovered in Great Britain, and this wood came from Great Britain at some point, and we've been perpetuating him ever since through grafting. But that graft, when you plant it, in order to maintain the dwarfing effect of that root, has to be planted with that bud. Thank you, honey. You know, getting older is kind of a pain sometimes, you know, because there are those things that you just can't access them when you want them. So anyway, you want that probably 6 inches, you know, 4 to 6 inches above soil level. If you put it at 2 inches, that may not be enough, because when you're, you know, you put mulch down, you do all those lovely things, before you know it, that scion, that top variety, starts putting out roots. And then you have an own root variety, which is like the standard root. Remember what I said about it wanting to grow 25, 30 feet high? You have just completely negated the effect of the dwarfing of that rootstock. So when you're planting, make sure that it's 4 to 6 inches above soil level, okay? And the food forest, I noticed, have trees that are planted right down here. So you know, they're still young. They can be lifted. And if you have trees that you planted too low, then you can still lift them if they're not too established. On the other hand, if you can only find, say you want a Cox's orange pippin, but you want it to grow as a standard tree, you can bury that graft. And then the scion on the top will grow its own roots, and then you will get a standard tree. So there are ways to deal with that so that you can get what you want. Okay, control. Okay, now back here, improve fruit quality. What we're doing when we're pruning is we want to encourage a balance between the vegetative part, or the actual growing part, and the reproductive part, which is the production of seeds, which along the way gives us the fruit that we're looking for. Vegetative growth doesn't have any fruit buds. So if you have been pruning your fruit tree really hard all the time, and all you're getting is a whole lot of sucker growth and nothing else, the reason is that you've been pruning it too hard or at the wrong time, so you're getting lots of vegetative growth, which doesn't produce fruit or produce fruit buds because it's not old enough. For a lot of fruit trees, that wood has to be a few years old, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. So first off, you got to know your buds. So the flowering fruit buds right here look very different than the vegetative buds. The vegetative buds are going to give you leaves, or they're going to give you extension growth. So they'll give you stems. And there's not a lot to look at, but if you look here at fruit buds, they're much bigger. They tend to stand out a little bit. And you need to be able to tell the difference between them, because you don't want to be cutting all these off. Otherwise, you're going to be cutting off your fruit. Okay? Fruit buds versus vegetative buds. Okay, the vegetative buds are the leaf buds. Fruit buds produce the flowers, which then turn into fruit. On apples, that wood has to be 2 to 4 years old. So what grew last year, which is that nice, smooth growth with all those little buds on it, it's not going to have fruit yet this year. It has to be at least 2-year-old, so the next section, or 3 or 4. That's where you're going to find your fruit buds. If you keep cutting all that stuff off, you're never going to get any fruit wood. Apricots, cherries, and peaches, on the other hand, produce their best fruit buds on what grew last year. So that's 1-year-old wood. So all that stuff that grew last year, that is what's going to give you your fruit this year. So you don't want to be cutting off too much of that. What you do want to cut off, or what you could cut off, is what fruited last year, because it's not going to give you as nice fruit this year. Your 1-year-old wood is. So I find these guys really easy to look at, to determine what to prune, because you don't have to look at how old the wood is. You can just go, oh, this grew last year, because all it has on here, it's just a nice, smooth extension growth. And that other stuff, it can go, because you want lots of hairy growth on these so that you're going to get your best fruit. Sour cherries, prune plums, 2 or 3-year-old wood, and pears, at least 2-year-old wood. Okay? So that's important when you're going out there, because it's entirely tempting to treat them all the same way, and you can see it is going to make a difference. All right, what drives plant growth? Well, we know when we're looking at a shrub of any sort, during the growing season, there are leaves. There's the top structure, which is all the stems and everything. And together, they are producing, through photosynthesis, the nutrients that are going into the plant. Then we have the trunk and the roots, where the carbohydrates and the nutrients are stored. What pulls it all together is the water. So we're either going to irrigate, or it's going to rain, whatever, but that's how everything stays in balance. And if there's too much on the top for what the roots can handle, usually stuff will die back. And if there's way more root than there is anything on the top, it'll put out a whole lot of growth. So why you need to know this is because if things are not in balance, which tends to get thrown out of balance when we prune, then we get reactions. And it's those reactions that we need to control. Okay? Any questions at this point? Am I losing you yet? No? Good. Okay. You know, pruning freaks out so many people that really, I tried to set it up so that it kind of has a natural progression, and I hope it works for you to understand. But if at any point you do have a question, then just say something. So when you're cutting, if you're pruning during the dormant season, then you're reducing the ratio of the top structure to the root. So during the root dormant season, this is basically what you're looking at, before pruning and after pruning. So when spring comes along, the tree is trying to use the sunlight, the water, everything else to balance the root mass with what's growing on the top. If you've cut off a whole lot of it, there's a lot more stored nutrients than what you're left with can take up. So I'll give you an example. In the fall, the leaves are storing nutrients before abscission and they drop. And those nutrients get stored in the trunk and in the roots. Then we come along in the winter and we cut a whole bunch of that off. And the following spring, there's all this stuff that has been stored. We've cut off all this stuff. And now where's it going to go? Now think of it this way. If you've got a hose and you put your finger over, your thumb over it, same water pressure, but you put your thumb over it and all of a sudden there's a whole lot smaller hole. And what happens? There's a lot of pressure. Same thing here. You've cut off a lot. There's a whole lot more pressure for those nutrients to go somewhere. So you get a huge growth response. It's like spurt, right? And that's what happens when you dormant prune, which is what we've been doing forever and ever. I had the story that I was going to tell and I decided to leave it, but I'll quickly go over it. Have you heard the story of the little girl whose mom was putting a ham in the oven and she cut the ends off, stuck it in the pot, and the little girl says, "Mom, what are you doing?" She said, "Oh, I'm just cutting the ends off the ham to put it before I put it in the oven." And she said, "Well, why do you do that?" "Well, I don't actually know. My mom always did it like that. So, Grandma's up there. Why don't you ask her why she did it?" And Grandma goes, "I don't know. My mom always did it like that, so I thought I would do it like that." And Grandma goes, "I didn't have a pot big enough." Yeah. So they've been doing it all those years the same way. In the same way that we've been doing pruning all these years the same way. It's time to change.
Yes.
So, anyway, here we go. When you cut during the winter, it's actually invigorating your tree. Are you seeing that now? Mm-hmm. Okay. So every time you are pruning during the winter, you are going to be forcing that tree into a growth response in the growing season. Mm-hmm. What did you want to do? You wanted that tree to be a bit smaller, right? Not working. Not working at all. So what you get is that major growth response. The plant regrows in an attempt to restore the balance between the top structure and the root. And dormant pruning, by the way, if you do it when it's too cold out, can also cause damage. So, some references will say -5. In the orchard, we use -18. But that takes me down here. That's the next one. I'll do it first. Why do fruit growers prune in the winter? Because they have time. That is why.
That makes sense.
They're too busy during the growing season. There's too much else to do. Yeah. In the winter, they're going to be sitting on their duff at home, or they're going to be pruning. So they would prune all winter, and if it got down to -18, then the danger of having ice crystals form in those cuts is too great. So then they could actually, in good conscience, take the day off. But, generally that's when they have the time. Hopefully your situation is a little bit different. And you can prune at times that are going to be more convenient for you, not as cold, and better for the plant. So the more severe you prune, the more vigorous the regrowth. And the more vegetative buds that you get, the fewer fruit buds. So, what we want to do is we want to switch that around. Okay, so I already answered that one. So dormant pruning, the plant regrows faster and thicker. So if you don't want to invigorate the plant, what should you do? Well, this is where plant physiology comes in. But before we get into that, right now, the timing of pruning. First off, there are the 4Ds. And I love the 4Ds because you can do the 4Ds of your pruning and you'll have most of your pruning done. So you take out anything that's dead, diseased, damaged, those are all pretty straightforward, and deranged. This is my own addition. Deranged means it's growing in the wrong place, it's going straight up, it's growing, so all those things that are going up, or you've got root suckers down at the bottom, but when they're higher up, they're called water sprouts. They need to come out because they're all vegetative growth and you don't need them. Also, if you've got double leaders, you need to take out one. So over here, okay, now this one has been broken. We have 3, and one has been broken, but there are 3 leaders here. One thing about if you're going tree shopping, what you want to do is you want to take a look, put your finger down down the crotch angle. Okay. Do you see all that light you can see under my finger? Yeah? What? You can't see me?
If you lift your black coat up, we can see air.
Okay, there. You see all that light? That is a very poor crotch. What you want is a U crotch that you can get your finger into, because what that's going to mean is that the growth there is going to be a lot stronger. In the winter, when you have crotches like this, you have a chance of snow and ice building in there and they crack. So you need to get rid of one of those there, because first off, you've got a double leader, which is already a bad thing, but I think I would get rid of this one and leave the strongest one in the middle for now. It's the best looking one. So you've gotten 2 different tips there. You don't want to have multiple leaders and you don't want to have those narrow crotches. When you're pruning, make your pruning cut really close to the bark, to the stem, because if you don't, you're going to leave little coat hangers. And believe me, when you're in a tree and you're picking and you haven't paid attention to those, you get caught up in them. So get rid of them right away. Don't do it. When anything that's grown inwards into your tree comes out, because if it's growing inwards, you're going to have crossing branches. So if you were tall enough and you could look down at the tree, what you're looking for is something that basically looks like spokes on a wheel coming from the central limb. Everything comes out from there, you've got no crossing branches, you've got nothing sticking up out of the way, nothing going down where it shouldn't be. So those are all those, the deranged branches. So anything that's in the way of traffic, I think I've covered almost everything. So the 4Ds of pruning can be taken out anytime. If you see a broken branch, cut it back. If you see a diseased branch, well, it just stands to reason. You need to take it out before it has a chance to spread somewhere else. So 4Ds of pruning, anytime. If you've got shrubs, ornamental shrubs now we're talking about, in your garden that bloom before the end of May, they formed their flower buds the previous season. So if you have a lilac tree or a mock orange, any of those things, my brother-in-law, my sister-in-law was telling me one day, my mock orange hasn't bloomed in years. And I looked at my brother-in-law and I says, when are you pruning? And he says, in the winter. I thought, oh, it's all his fault. Because what he was doing is he was taking all the flower buds that had formed the previous season and he pruned them all off, thinking he was pruning properly. But you don't prune that type of plant, or like the bridal spirea, which blooms before the end of May, until right after they have finished blooming. Then they've got all season to grow and form more flower buds for the next year. If you wait too long, then you're not going to have enough time to form flower buds for the next year. So you might go a year without flowers. So doing it early is important. If, however, it blooms during the summertime, then their buds are formed on what grows this year. So you can cut them right back if you want them in the spring. And a lot of people, you know, the little spireas, you might recognize this right here, still in the same family as the bridlery spirea, but a totally different kind of plant. And so genetically they're closely related, but they don't look very much the same. The gold flame spirea blooms in the summertime, but it has gorgeous foliage. There are a lot of them that do. And if you leave them the way so many of the commercial landscapes do, and they just let them get twiggier and twiggier and twiggier, they're just ugly. So what you do is you cut them right back, either in the fall or the spring, because they're, you know, they're dormant, they're not doing anything, it'll be fine, they're under the snow during the winter, and they're super hardy. Cut them back to about 4 inches. And what will happen is you'll get all kinds of new growth, the foliage will be bigger, and the color of the foliage will be much more dramatic. So if you want the drama, you do the pruning. If you want them just to look like shrubby little balls, the way that, you know, the commercial landscapers are doing, then don't do anything. You don't have to do anything. But if you actually want to get the best out of them, you cut them back, and they're still going to bloom in the summer, which you want. It'll just be maybe a week later. Nothing to lose, and so much to gain. So your timing of pruning, now we get into the important part, using plant physiology. Now the timing of plant growth is important to consider, because that will help you offset the negative effects of pruning. Because pruning acts, you know, it does damage. So we want to work with the plant to get the best effect. So I already told you, if you prune when the plant is dormant, you're going to get a huge growth response. If you wait until after bud break and you're already getting growth on your plant, a lot of the nutrients that were stored for winter are already being used up. If you prune at that time, you're not going to get a good growth response. So that's one time to do it. So you've got lots of time yet. If you've been thinking you're going to have to go out tomorrow and prune, no, you've got lots of time.
Good.
Because it's not a date, it is a time. It's a stage, okay? So the plants have already put on growth, the buds are expanding, a lot of those nutrients have already been used that were stored. Then there's summer pruning, and that, calling it summer pruning is a bit of a misnomer, but that is what's used for it. Because the terminal bud, we're going to talk more about this, so you know, I don't want to lose you just yet, but the terminal bud is the bud at the end of the branch. Every branch has a terminal bud on it. When it first forms, it's really soft, you know, like a succulent plant, right? It's really soft, it bends. But during the course of the summer, it lignifies, it actually becomes woody. And at that point, it is ready for winter. It's done its job. It may be in the beginning of August, end of July, but in terms of the growth, that is getting ready for winter. So it has lignified. At that point, if you go in and do some pruning, the plants will go into the winter then. So you come in and you're going to do the same amount of pruning that you would have done in February, but now you're doing it in August. When you go into the winter, the plant goes into the winter with the same amount of nutrients in the trunk and the roots as what it will need next spring. So what happens? You don't get that major growth response. So all of a sudden it starts to make a bit of difference. You're going, oh, I don't have to prune in February, I can prune in August. Oh, this might be nice. Yours, could be good. So, but it has, and this is not a date either, this is a stage. So on different plants, it could be very different. in terms of, you know, when it actually lignifies. But the wood has to be hardened, and then you can go in and do your pruning. Now the only problem with this is it's a whole lot easier to see what needs to come out when there are no leaves. And so now you're contending with leaves. So sometimes if you are thinking that something has to come out and you want to remember that, you know, flagging tape is cheap. Just go in and put, or spray paint. Spray paint the things that you think have to come out so that you can find them back when it's time to take them out. So wound closure happens most quickly when the cambium layer, that's the green layer under the bark, is in active growth. And that's in late spring and in early fall. So at that point, that's when you're thinking about pruning, but also if you've got big limbs to take out, now that's a huge wound. So taking out a big limb, this is when you want to do it, at those 2 times. Because at that point, then, because the cambium layer is in active growth, it's going to, you know, dry off, and it will callus much faster than if you had done it during the dormant season. Okay, are you following? I'm so excited. I can't tell you how many times I've done pruning courses and I see a lot of eyes kind of like, yeah, exactly, not sure what to think. So anyway, pruning leaves wounds. There's no doubt about it. So what you want to do is you want to keep them to a minimum. So you're never going to take out more than 1/3 off the plant any one time. Okay, if you do more than that, then you're putting the plant under stress. But remember, I already told you plants are forgiving. So they'll usually recover, but there might be a growth response because you took off so much and the roots are trying to even things out. You want to keep your pruning wounds relatively small. That doesn't mean that you're going to cut off all the little stuff. Oh, I took some pictures in our neighborhood and I thought I'll put them in my, I decided not to. And the reason being that, you know, these lovely little trees and they're all nipped on the ends. And that's the way so many people do it. And it is absolutely wrong. And I'll show you why in just a little bit. But, you know, if this is what you've done, you go, okay, let's learn what we're supposed to do. Your cuts should be clean. So this is where your tools are important. Make sure they're sharp. Make sure they work properly. They're not leaving breaks or catches or anything. And as my husband would be very quick to point out, make sure that you're using the pruning tools properly. Every picture out there says that you cut like this with the cut blade on the top and your hook underneath. No. What you do is you use your hook on the top and your cut blade goes in the direction of the sap flow. So that way, if your tools are good, you should always get clean cuts. And your cut should be right. But test this. Take a look, you know, online, whatever. Oh, online. I should put here, don't go there for your pruning info. It's awful. The misinformation is absolutely awful, and most of it is way out of date. It just, I was horrified, actually. So, did you notice that I'm opinionated? Okay. So pruning should be done when wound closure will happen as quickly as possible, particularly when you're making large limb cuts, or when you're pruning certain plants that are susceptible to disease, that's bleeding. These are the exceptions, which we'll talk about next. So some of the exceptions are the ones that bleed. So if you've ever pruned a maple during the dormant season, you'll notice that it's dripping, dripping, dripping. Or your grapes, drip, drip, drip. That's not the time to cut them. You don't do it during dormant season. You prune maples and birches when they're in full leaf. And then there are leaves that will take up that extra moisture, and you won't have the dripping as well. Trees that are susceptible to pests, like in this case silverleaf on plum, if you prune them during winter, then what you want to do is you want to wait until late spring, or the summer prune, And plants in this category are cherries, plums, oak, elms, honey locusts, and walnuts. If you have any of those, make a note of that. Because guess what? You can put it off for a while. You don't have to prune them right away. So that's going to cut down on the disease issues. And a few more. Red twig dogwoods. Now, you know, people will look at references or somebody will say, well, cut them back by a third every year. And I have seen red twig dogwoods where somebody has actually given them a bowl cut, cutting back a third of what was growing on the outside. And what happens is the bark on these plants is that bright red color for 3 years, and then it becomes gray. Okay? So what you end up with is this gray plant with little red bits on the end. So that's not how you do it. This is where thinning comes in, and you're taking out 1/3 every year right down to where that stem began as a bud, so to soil level. And when you do that, because that strong red coloration is there for the 3 years, you are completely rejuvenating that plant over a 3-year period, for one thing, and you're going to have that bright, striking red or yellow, if you're growing the yellow one, whatever. With these plants that have that, you're going to have that bright, striking color in the winter. And you know, that's one of the reasons why we grow them. We want something to look at. Remember, winter around here, you know, by the time you figure the shoulder seasons, you're looking at 6 months. Way too long. So we need stuff that looks interesting in the winter, and you can do it with plants that have interesting bark color, or plants that have berries, that sort of thing. So, you know, we need it, or at least I need it. Some plants like grapes and poplars, Virginia creeper, very closely related to grapes, bleed heavily when they're pruned in the spring. So you prune them in late spring after bud break. Okay? You don't want to do it with the summer pruning the way that you do with a lot of other stuff, because at that point they're in full fruit and you're going to be cutting off fruit. So generally you do it when in late spring after bud break. Okay, I need some more. Now, you might think terminal bud, apical bud, what is that? Well, it's just the end bud. And if you think you've never done this before, or if you've ever, you know, planted snapdragons and you wanted them to bush out more when you transplanted them in the garden and you take out the top, you're pinching. You're taking out the apical bud. So you've done it many times before with houseplants. If you've got a coleus and you want to make it bush out, you pinch out the terminal bud. And it makes those side branches then that were hiding in there all of a sudden come to life, and you get a much bushier and a fuller plant. It's not necessarily smaller, but it, you know, that's determined by its genetics, but it will be bushier. When a seed germinates, the first thing you get are the cotyledons, and after that, you've got the apical bud, the apex, the terminal bud. So, you know this already. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. So let's learn a little bit more. That, on a branch, that apical bud, the words are used interchangeably. So, you know, if you're ever reading it or talking about it, if I say terminal, I mean apical, and the other way around. That apex determines what happens down below. It has a lot of power. You know, side branches, that apex determines what happens along that branch. All that growth is determined by what the apex is doing. And the hormones that are in there at the apex is one called auxin. And in the green layer, under the bark, called the cambium, there are 2 parts. And in that, on the outside, the auxins are flowing down. So that's important, because they're like a sheath. And it's going right down. And in just a second, just to explain this a little bit more, because that apex, that apical up there is controlling what's going on. The further you get down in the tree, the fewer buds there are, the less growth there is. That's why if a tree's been let go and hasn't been trained properly, all the growth is going to be in the top, because everything down below has lost out. So you know those big old open center trees? Because they were not kept in balance, what happened is those limbs up on the top took control. They're bigger, heavier, and everything that was underneath became wimpy, lost out, died. And over time in the commercial world, that system fell out of favor, because you can't maintain that system over a long time. You get old wood. There's a better way to do it. So we'll talk about that in just a second. So the intensity of apical dominance does depend on the species. Some of them are very strongly apical dominant, others not as much. But just remember how much that apex, how much control it has on what happens down below. The other hormone that we have to learn about, other than the auxins come down. I've heard, some people have said, it's not gravity driven. I don't know what else it is. It goes down, period. I think gravity makes sense. Nothing else does. So we'll say it's gravity. Inside that outer layer of the auxins is another layer that has the cytokinins. They want to grow. They want to go up. So all the growth is heading straight up. We have to control that in order to make sure that what's on the side gets a little bit of those riches that all want to go up to the top. And there are ways to do that through training and through pruning. Not all fruit tree development is through pruning. There are ways to train that are actually better than pruning. So now remember, auxins and cytokinins. The cytokinins go up through the xylem, and the auxins go down through the phloem, which is the outer layer, if you can picture that. And the auxins that are produced up here are very important. They're produced in that terminal bud, but they're also produced in buds along the way, in any of the growth buds, and in seeds. So if you've got a lot of fruit on your tree, it's going to slow it right down, because those seeds are producing auxins, which are wanting nothing much to grow except the extension growth on the end, because the auxins just want that bud on the end to grow. They don't want all those other buds to grow. Is that making sense? Have I lost you? Did that make sense, Jay?
Yeah, can I add something?
Yeah.
Take a look at the cox orange tree.
Good example. You have terminal buds on the end of all of these branches through the growing season. The auxin flows down the tree and suppresses shoot growth. The further you get down on this tree, the more auxin is present, because you've got all these branches that grew up at the top. The cytokinins are blowing out the top where the least amount of auxin is. As it flows down, you've got auxin produced from all those tips pumping into the branch, and no growth here, right? All your growth is there. What you want to grow are these branches, 4 branches here. Just pruning this tree, you take all these off. Totally.
I can go, people, I paid for that.
All of those come off. You want 4 branches. 1, 2, 3, 4 here. All this comes off. All that auxin production is gone, and it allows these 4 main branches at the bottom to grow.
Okay, now there is an exception. If you decide that you're gonna be doing a ride-on mower underneath, and you want the branches to be a little higher, you can just cut those lower ones off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and then you leave 4
Yeah.
at this point, maybe that one, and 4 up here,
Yeah.
and take the rest out.
So you trim back the leader?
Only,
Always trim back the leader a little bit, but we'll get to that. Yeah, but,
We'll get
go
to
ahead,
that?
we'll get to that, yeah. What were you gonna say?
when you do trim back the leader, you cut it where you want the next set of branches, and within 8 inches of your cut, then you will get branching again, right? Same as here. The tip was cut there. This is a 2-year tree. They made the cut there. All the growth occurred within 8 inches of that cut. Remember, when you cut up here, all the growth is gonna occur in that 8 inches again. So then, are you gonna get into this?
So thank you. Yeah, thank you. Very
Pick
much.
up your paycheck downstairs.
Cook something. So I think that covers that. To show you how the typical growth of an auxin-dominant tree is compared to a cytokinin-dominant tree, here we've got a Douglas fir, where the auxins are determining that nothing below it is going to grow all that much, so you get that Christmas tree shape. And on the other one, which happens to be a dogwood, you don't have a central leader, and that's the way it grows, and everything is kind of growing out sideways, because the cytokinins there they've got the strength. They're in control. So most of the trees, street trees, that little leaf linden, they grow like a central leader. So, and the same rules that we're talking about for fruit trees are going to apply. Ooh, I should have made that slide a little smaller. Anyway, when you're going to be pruning, this is actually from a rose pruning course, but the same information was important. This is a good cut because the nutrients come up here to the bud, but only to the bud. Here, they're going to come here. There might be some that goes up to the bud here, but it's not going to be nearly what it would have been here, and you will get weak growth, or it might die. This one, it's too high above. So here you've got one of those clothes hangers. And what's going to happen is it's going to die back, because there's no reason for the nutrients to go any further than this. So you'll get all kinds of little stubs. So don't leave long stubs. Did I see a hand up here? No? Okay. And then this one is way too close to the bud. That's obviously going to be a game over. So now we're into pruning cuts. This is the good one. This is the one that you want to know inside, out, and backwards. And it's easy. With a thinning cut, what you're doing is you are cutting back to where it began as a bud, or further down, into the tree. You're taking out an entire limb, or you're going to go right down to the bottom and take it out of soil level. That is a thinning cut. What thinning does not do is it doesn't stimulate a whole bunch of regrowth. The other cut that I'm going to show you in a minute, that's what it does. You get a whole lot of regrowth. Thinning reduces the bulk of the plant, so it allows more light and air penetration, and it makes the plant somewhat smaller. So let's say here, if I were to cut off, this one shows this one cut off, but if I had left this one and instead cut here, you can see how my plant would be made a little bit smaller. Do you get that? Okay. So you can reduce the bulk of your plant to get a smaller plant. And thinning maintains the natural growth of the plant. So you're not giving the plant a bowl cut. You're going right in, taking out limbs. So if you have a young maple tree or a young apple tree, when you're finished, it's still going to look like an apple tree. It's not going to look like a ball. Okay, that ball, that's not what you want. My neighbors, they're trying to do the ball. And what they're going to end up with is a whole bunch of regrowth. And that tree is going to be bigger than what it was before. It's going to be a whole lot hairier because where they cut it, instead of having just one, now they're going to have 4 branches. So it gets a lot thicker, just as big as it was before, but it's not smaller. And it is, because it's so much thicker, you have more disease incidence with that. So this is the good one. And when you do this, you'll see what we're talking about here. You're cutting off where it began as a bud, where it began as a bud, and you're left with something that when you get regrowth, see, it's not crazy. You get a little bit of regrowth, but it's not crazy regrowth. So the plant is more airy, but it's not overly vigorous. Here we've got some trees. When you've got a tree, this is a before picture, afterwards, it looks very similar. But what you've done is you've taken out 4 leaves, and you're left with something that looks very similar, but a lot better. Because it's more airy and open, light can get in there. If you're growing fruit, you're going to have fruit throughout your tree instead of just on the ends. And if it's an ornamental tree, you're going to have something that is going to be more disease resistant and also can handle the wind better. I don't know if you remember, I can date myself very easily talking about things that happened, 30 years ago. But there was an incident in Vancouver on the North Shore where a big subdivision had been put in, and they had uplimbed all the trees, big old Douglas firs, and left a little triangle at the top. And then strong winds blew over trees in Stanley Park, knocked the tops off all of those trees. Because there was nothing underneath, there was this sail on the top, and the trunk didn't have the strength to hold it. If they had done something where they thinned it out, taking out limbs, I said I wasn't going to talk about evergreens, but this is one case where I will. If they had taken out limbs, it would have allowed air to go through, which would have made it much safer during the windstorm. So for those of you who are, looking down at somebody's property and there's a tree in the way and you're going, oh, I wish they'd top it, no, there's a better way to do it. You thin it out, doesn't get rid of the tree, but you can see through it. You can create windows so you can see through it. It maintains the tree, the integrity of the tree, and everybody's going to be happy. Now when you're pruning shrubs, when you're thinning, you're not doing the bowl cut. What you're doing is you're taking out branches all the way back down to the soil where need be. And what you want to do, you're taking out the 4Ds. The last one, when you're doing the 4Ds, is basically the oldest. So you want to cut out the oldest wood. And if that means that you're at 30% by doing the 3Ds, that's enough. You've done enough. But if you still have more to do, then cut out the oldest wood. And you can tell the oldest wood because if it's a thorny thing, it's going to be thornier than the others. If it's something that doesn't have thorns, it's going to be a heavier bark. It's grayer. So you can tell which ones they are. You cut them right back as close to soil level as you can. So this is something that you do with almost all the fruiting shrubs and with your ornamental shrubs. And that makes it really easy. If you think about it, if you're taking out a third every year, over a 3-year period, you have completely rejuvenated that plant. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just take off an arm this year, that one next year, completely rejuvenate ourselves? Well, it doesn't work, but it does work with plants. So, very easy. Remember the 4Ds, because when you take them outdoors with your pruning tools, you've got almost everything covered. Now, when you're fruiting You've got thin fruiting shrubs. Same rules apply there. You're using thinning cuts. You thin out 1/3, but blueberries are a bit of an exception. With the blueberries, right here, I have a blueberry, a very hairy blueberry. It needs to have, you see all this weak and wimpy growth that's in there? It needs to come out. That's not going to do much of anything, and it's not going to get a whole lot stronger. But you've got some really nice, strong growth in here. So by the time you've gotten rid, I would call weak and wimpy growth, deranged. Okay? So that's still part of your 4Ds. So that comes out. Any branches that are crossing, they come out. And then you take a look at it and you say, that pretty much has it covered. Remember, when you look down, you kind of want to see something that looks like spokes coming out from a central portion where you've got multiple stems here. So it's not quite the same thing, but you've got a couple of plants, so you can take that analogy a little bit further, and that's how you want it to grow. Then you take a look at them, and when it looks pretty clear, if there's any really old wood, like this one right down here is an older one, but it's got some new growth going, but it's growing in the wrong place. So I would take that out right down to here. Okay, sometimes you have to be brittle to be kind. And your plant will be happier for it. Then during the course of the growing season, you'll get new growth from the base, which is what happens when you're doing that 1/3 thing. You get new growth from the base. And when that happens, they're going to grow up here, and you go, oh, that doesn't look very good anymore. Well, the good news is that if you just take out that terminal bud, what happens is all these little buds down here then produce little side branches, and they are going to give you your fruit next year. So you want it to get those side branches, okay? So that's just an extra that you do with blueberries, doesn't really count for the rest. The thing about blueberries, because people don't do this often enough, they need a very acidic soil. Our son works as an agricultural, what's the word? Advisor. Down at the coast with blueberry growers. They add sulfur to the soil because even there where the soil is naturally acidic, it's not acidic enough. So imagine what ours is like up here. Like, I think where we are now, it's probably about 6.5. I know for sure it was up at the orchard, it was 6.5. They need it down around 4.5 to 5. Every step, so from 7 is neutral, down to 6 is 10 points on a logarithmic scale. And as you go down, it gets more excessive. From 6 to 5 is 10 times 10, so that's 100. And then you go a little bit more than that, and then you're over 100 times more acidic than what our soil is naturally. So we're talking about needing a lot of sulfur. You know, when you go into a garden center and they tell you, you know, oh, just throw a little bit of peat moss in there, it's naturally acidic, it'll be fine. Absolutely not. It's a slow road to death. So you need to make sure that you put lots of organic material in there. You know what works really well is rotted sawdust, because it takes forever to break down. And you don't want it to be breaking down. Peat breaks down really quickly. And it's at the end of its decomposition process when you get it. So its acidity is highly overrated. It's not that acidic anymore. So it's a soil conditioner, not an acidifier. What you need is sulfur. And it depends on your soil. If you've got a light soil, a sandy soil, you're not going to need as much sulfur as if you've got a clay soil. Clay soil needs a lot of sulfur because clay doesn't want to let go. It wants to do what it wants to do, and you have to add a lot of sulfur to it for it to change it all. Any questions about blueberries? Doesn't really go with what we're talking about, but you know, I have to get on my soapbox every now and then.
So adding sulfur, is that to just get better fruit, or is it just for the
No,
health
it's
of the
to
plant?
acidify the soil.
Right.
And when the soil is acidic, because the niche in the environment where it lives means the soil has to be acidic for it to function well, then the whole plant works as a mechanism if the pH is where it's supposed to be. If it is not acidic enough, the leaves become chlorotic. So you'll get green leaf or yellow leaves with green veining. That's a sign right there that you need to do something Even though it looks like it's an iron deficiency, which it is, it's an iron deficiency brought about by the fact that the pH is not right. It's too alkaline. So when you fix that, then your plant will function. And then you'll get the fruit and the better growth and all that sort of stuff. Okay, and as a blueberry plant gets older, you can see how hairy this is. As they get older, you know, you're looking at a plant that usually is going to get around 5 feet high. So you can top them a little bit to keep them down if you want. Also, you know, the fall color, absolutely stunning. The flowers are beautiful. So you can put them in your garden, in your ornamental garden, because they're beautiful. It doesn't have to be out in a food garden somewhere. You can put them wherever you got room. Just remember that you make sure that you amend the soil so that they can grow well. And then prune them so that as they get older, you're leaving 6 to 8 main stems rather than a whole lot of hairy growth. Because when you have a lot of hairy growth, then you get shooting, and then you have not as good fruiting, and you have more disease instinct. So, thinning cane fruits. Here we're talking about raspberries. Nowadays we have 2 types of raspberries. There's the July bearing, and then what are commonly called everbearing, but they're actually more late summer, fall bearing. So they don't go all the way through the season. I think that, you know, it's good for PR, but it actually isn't right. So how you prune them is going to depend on what type of raspberry you have. If you've got the July bearing varieties, then you're going to get a lot of growth coming from the bottom, and you want to get rid of what bloomed this year. Really easy to see when all those carcasses are hanging there, right? And the flower remains are there. Cut them down to soil level, as close to soil level as you can get. Thin them right out. And then if they're getting really, really congested with lots of stems, leave maybe half a dozen. No more than that. Because your plants will be much happier that they're not fighting for nutrients all the time. So that one's easy. If, however, they are blooming and fruiting later in the season, oh, by the way, when they're growing, it's called a primocane. When they actually are blooming and fruiting, it's called a floricane. So in every case, we're taking out the floricanes. With the ones that are the later blooming ones, when you're going to prune them, best to wait till spring. Now, I had fall bearing raspberries, and I hedged my bets thinking that if I left them and didn't cut them back until they had some berries in July, like the July bears, then I could cut them back and I would get a crop later in the fall. Yeah, it worked, but it took a lot out of the plants. It's much better, cut them back to soil level in the spring. Because all of that, we're talking now about the fall bearers, right? Okay, because they bear on what grows this year. So you cut them right back to soil level. You don't leave anything from last year. The nice thing about that is that you don't have problems with disease carryover. So, and that's a good thing at any time. With blackberries, we know blackberries like to grow to take over the world. And it doesn't matter if you're going with really thorny ones or if you're going with thornless. I personally, thornless all the way. Chester's really good. It is thornless, it has big berries, they taste good. And people will tell you, oh, you gotta go to the coast and you gotta pick the wild ones because they taste way better. Well, I'm okay not getting tangled up in thorns and, battling with them. So I'll take the thornless ones, thank you very much. And what we did with ours is we let them grow when they were finished, because they are producing like September onwards until the frost kills them off. Clean them up in the spring. I did do them sometimes in the fall when I had some time, but I found that there was a greater chance of winter damage if I pruned them in the fall. So I would say leave it, prune them back in the spring, cut out everything that fruited last year, right back to soil level if you can. Take all those ones that grew last year because they're going to give you your fruit this year. And if you've got a fence or a big trellis that you can put them on, don't cut them off because you've got production all along that long cane. Yes.
What if you have like like I just planted the raspberries last year.
Mm-hmm.
So, and they grew really tall,
Mm-hmm.
like, you know, so I'm
You're
gonna,
gonna have fruit on them.
yeah, so I'm gonna cut them back this year. Or should I
Not
cut the
until
top?
after they have fruited.
Okay.
Don't
So
cut them
just
back.
leave them right now.
Just leave them. What you can do with
Okay.
raspberries,
Yeah.
if you go down to the coast, you'll see a lot of the commercial growers will take and they'll actually bend them down
Okay,
on
yes.
themselves.
Okay.
So if you've got them growing on a post,
Yeah.
then you can tie them to the
Okay.
post, or if you've got a trellis or whatever, you can
Yeah.
tie them to the trellis. The fact of the matter is that when you make that bend, you actually are changing the hormone balance in that stem as it goes down here.
Okay.
So the fruit down here is going to be smaller,
Oh.
but there's still fruit. If you cut that off, you would lose all of that production.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know, I would say leave it,
Okay.
tie it back, and then you're gonna cut those down and leave whatever grows this year, and then you can tie them again for next year,
Okay.
okay? If you want, if you don't have the room with blackberries to let them grow 15 feet one way and 15 feet the other, then you can lop off the top. But it's the same story as what we were just talking about. You're cutting off so much of that production. So if you have room, let them go. Put them on a trellis where they can, or on a fence. We have them on a fence. And you know, they grow like crazy. So, and all of that is excellent production. Thinning grapes, well, people, this is another thing, where people get so strung out. Home gardeners are way too gentle. We need to be brutal with them. What you need to do is you need to have what's going to produce your fruit this year, and you have to have one as your backup that is going to give you your fruit for next year. So this way, you only need about 10 buds on this. So what you have from last year is probably a gazillion vines that are going everywhere, and they're probably 10 feet this way and 10 feet that way. So you're going to end up with a big pruning pile. So, you know, get into making grapevine wreaths or something like that, because you don't have lots. But with this, all you really need is that fruiting cane and your backup, your renewal. That's it. Just two.
How many buds on the renewal?
On the renewal, I would say to hedge your bet, I would go with 3. You can get by with just 1, but if something happens to that one, then you've lost it. So I would give it 3, and then see where the growth comes, and take off what isn't growing where you want it to grow. Does that make sense? Okay. Easy. You don't have to get strung out doing grapes. But we did talk about this before. They bleed heavily, so wait until late spring to do your pruning.
So you are just gonna have one branch.
Yeah,
And
just
it's
one.
going to then branch off itself.
Yeah, it'll be sending out all kinds of stuff. But that's going to be, that's hairy growth. That you can prune off in the summer if you want. Like some varieties like Himron, all they want to do is grow all kinds of green leafy growth. But, you know, if you've got 2 layers on your trellis, you can have, you know, your one situation on the bottom, you can have another one on the top. But
10
if you,
buds on each.
yeah, buds on each of them and let them do their thing. But in the summertime, if you've got a lot of hairy growth, like on the Himrod, which is a seedless green one, with loose clusters, it's hardy here, so a lot of people grow it. Go in there and do a summer pruning. Get rid of a lot of that stuff. Because they are the sugar factories, yes, you're not wanting to cut everything off. But they're shading the fruit. You know, you're not getting the sugars that you could get if you go in and you do a major haircut on them.
But then you're only gonna get like 10 clusters of grapes.
Yeah, if you only have one, yeah, but you know what, you get bigger grapes.
On the grapes,
10.
the 10 buds turn into 10 branches,
Yeah.
and they fruit on those
Yes.
branches.
But
Okay.
usually just the bottom 3 or so,
Okay.
okay? But that is where your fruit wood is.
Okay.
And that's all you need. Now this is the pruning cup number 2. This is really good if you want to make a hedge. If you're doing anything else, no. This is what my neighbors are doing. They're going and they're cutting off all the tips, right? And what you get with this is you're basically, doing a bowl cut. And you're making random cuts, sometimes it's called tipping or shaping, and heading stimulates rapid regrowth, and we'll talk about that in just a minute, and it makes the plant thicker and fuller, but not smaller, because it's genetically programmed to grow to this high. You cut it back down here with all those cuts, and it'll go, and it'll be right back to where it was, but it'll be a lot thicker. So this is perfect if you're trying to make a hedge. Not so good for anything else. So good for hedging in topiary, but let's see what happens when you do this. So here, if you remember the other illustration, when the thinning cuts were made, there was short growth throughout the plant. And there wasn't a big growth response. Here, they've cut off that apical bud. So all those buds below it now have freedom because the apex is no longer controlling what's happening there. And they go, and that's why this is good for hedging. Does that make sense? Because you get all this growth. Not good for anything else. Sometimes it's appropriate in some situations with some plants, but if you're doing a fruit tree, not so much. So, the plant is definitely not smaller. Now this is an important thing right here. This is if you're dormant pruning and you have this 1-year-old growth. So let's take a look here. Here we have what grew last year. Here's the line where it started. And all of this grew last year. This is my apex right here, the apical bud. If I take that, if I don't take it out, what's going to happen is what happens in that first illustration right there. There will be some extension growth and there will be a little bit down here, not much. But in that 2-year-old wood, down here, if we had older wood, we'd start getting fruit wood, okay?
And you'll get fruit buds form on that branch that grew last year.
For next year. That will give you fruit next year. Yeah. So, the interesting thing about this is that if you prune it back by 1/3, so that's about there, then you're going to get some fairly vigorous regrowth. You see where that happens right there? Then if we prune it back 2/3 down here, or in that middle portion, look at the growth response. It's a huge growth response. All of these buds are here like, oh, that apical bud's gone. There's nobody telling me what I have to do anymore. And they go, and that's what's happening most of the time when people do all that bowl cut. It's in this section right here. And they get this huge regrowth with what was 1 is now 3 really healthy stems going up there. Okay? So that's why this type of pruning is not going to give you the result that you want if you're trying to control the size of your plant and also set it up for fruit growth, because you're getting lots of vegetative growth. And remember, vegetative growth doesn't have fruit buds. The fruit buds come later on the older wood. So the only time that it's a plus to cut back in here with that 1-year-old wood, what produces fruit on 1-year-old wood? Do you remember? No, not pears. Peaches. Peaches, sweet cherries, and apricots. Those 3. They're all members of the prunus family. So are sour cherries and plums, but they don't bear until 2-year-old wood. So with the peach, this is going to produce fruit this year. And the only time you would want to cut it back is if it's sticking out way too far. And I was talking to James about this because I'm going, okay, if I cut this back, especially during dormant season, then I'm going to have a real growth response. But then he reminded me that even if we cut this off, all those fruit buds and the fruit that forms afterwards has auxins. And so they shut down the growth in here dramatically. So you're not going to get a big growth response. You will get the fruit, but you will get lots of growth other places. Peaches tend to get quite hairy, so you have to do a lot of pruning with them, but remember, they bear on 1-year-old wood. So be careful that you don't prune out too much of it, otherwise you're cutting off your production. So does that make sense? Isn't that interesting though? You know, finally you go, oh, there's actually a reason if I cut this and this happens? Huh. If, however, you cut back right to the base of the 1-year-old or right into the 2-year-old wood, that slows it down. And sometimes if a plant is really vigorous, by cutting back into that older wood, then you can slow it down. So tree topping is a result of what kind of pruning? Heading.
Heading.
Yeah, it's heading. So a heading cut is a bowl cut. And other than the fact that you really don't want to top a tree because you know you're really affecting the root to top ratio, you're also exposing all of these to sunburn. They're not used to that. So you can get disease issues from it. But this ugliness right here is what results. So it's bigger than it was before. Exactly what you don't want. So if they had gone in and done thinning cuts, taking out entire limbs, taking out the 4Ds, you know, anything that's crossing, anything that's growing in the wrong direction, they would have had something that would maintain the form of the plant. They could have made it a little bit smaller depending on which side branches they went to, but they certainly wouldn't get this mess. And the problem with all of those is because they're so fast growing, they're really weak wooded. You know the rotten trees, you know, I call them the junk trees, the willows, and Lombardy poplars, you know, things like that. People love them because they're really fast growing. But because they're really fast growing, they're really prone to breakage, to disease, and to insect infestation. So they're junk trees. This is now a junk tree. Okay? Where are we? Oh, we're already over time. Okay, we're getting there. Which type of pruning cuts have we used here? This is a forsythia. So here we have one, this is a thinning cut, where they have taken down to the base and to the side where the branch or whatever began as a bud. What you end up with is something that's very natural looking. If you like to bring them in to put into a vase in the spring, because it's just about the first thing in the spring that's blooming, you've got nice long branches that are flowers all the way down. And then we have this one that is the result of a bowl cut. And a bowl cut that was done in the spring. So there are big areas that have no flowers because they were all cut off. All right? And it looks a little bit like an old lady in a girdle. You know, it doesn't look quite natural. So, anyway, you know, this is what you're not trying to get. You want to use thinning cuts to maintain the natural habit of the plant. When you're pruning a large limb, this you can find online if you forget. I think I did put this in your handout, but your first cut is not here. If you make it right here where you want to take it off, what's going to happen is you get down to this area, it's going to pull on it and it's going to rip all the bark down here. You're going to have a big wound. And by the way, you do not use wound dressings. Okay? Because moisture will gather underneath. You'll actually have a bigger problem than if you don't use it. So, not recommended anymore. Haven't been for years, they're still available. But yeah, not recommended. What you want to do is you make your first cut as an undercut here until your saw binds. And then you do a second cut just outside of that and down to the point. At that point it will rip away, but it's not going to rip all the way down here. And the funny thing is it kind of goes not, like this, it kind of bounces up and away. And so, you know, it doesn't usually land on you, which is a good thing. And then your final cut, there's a branch collar right here. It's kind of like an elephant knee. It's a little bit wrinkly. You want to cut just outside of that because that's where you get the best healing. The cambium layer right there, over time will, you know, it'll dry off, and then over time you'll get it go right over. So it might not happen in your lifetime, but if the tree lives long enough, it'll completely cover it up. Okay, and the best time to prune is in late spring or late summer when the cambium is in active growth. So many different types of pruning tools with the secateurs, which are the hand ones. The one thing I would say, I hope that they'll allow it here. For many years I used a number 2 Falco, and one because that's what my husband had, and then I won one, and it was a number 2 Falco. But my hand would always get really tired because it was too big for my hand. So find something that works in your hand. I ended up getting a number 6, made all the difference in the world. It's a little bit smaller blade, but it feels so much better. I can work much longer than I could using a number 2. With your pruning saw, it's not like your regular wood saw. It actually, you know, will cut much more efficiently, and it gets into those places that are hard to get into. So that is worth having. A hedge pruner, if you have a hedge and you're going to do this yourself, get one that has a bit of a. Did you bring one up, Jane?
I did.
No. Get one that has a bit of a notch in it so that you can grab hold of the branch that you're going to cut and hold it in place. Pole pruners, handy in some ways, but the big problem with these is that people tend then to do what my neighbors are doing. They're cutting off all the ends of things instead of getting in there and using something that's a bit bigger like a lopper or the saw to take out bigger wood so that you make more thin cuts. And then a hedge trimmer, the electronic one, if you do gas or electric, sure make life a lot easier. Okay, so this is the point where I was going to say, if you don't want to talk fruit trees, you can leave. And anybody want to go? Okay, well then let's just quickly go over this. A much easier form of training, apple trees particularly, you can use this with every type of fruit tree, but with peaches in particular, you're better off with an open center, and we'll get to that in just a minute. I'll explain it. With the central leader, you're using the fact that apical dominance is going to control what happens in this tree. You can see the Christmas tree shape, okay? What you do when you're training is you have to make sure that those bottom limbs are the strongest. And in order to get any nutrients, because all the nutrients want to go straight up, that's where things are going. If they're too flat, they don't get nutrients. So you have to train them so that they're at the steepest angle. So eventually when they get older, that'll change and it'll flatten. But when they're younger, you want this angle here to be about 60 degrees. And you want the wood here to be the strongest. So obviously in our cactus orange right here, those branches on the bottom, they're weak and wimpy. They are not going to get nutrients because they just haven't got the oomph to do it. So you either do what Jane said, where you take, you know, those stronger ones on the top and you get rid of them altogether to allow those lower ones to get the nutrients they need to grow, or you have it so that your first whorl of branches is higher and you take out those weak and wimpy ones. Your choice on what you do. So, but this is number 1 because this is where you're starting. So you want that lower whorl to be the heaviest, always. Has to have the strongest limbs, okay? And that's partly the bully factor. Because if they're stronger and bigger, they're going to get nutrients just because they are stronger and bigger. Then, as you develop your second whorl of branches, your angle here, now this drawing is not good, by the way. It was the only one that I could find anything like it, but it really isn't good because it shows this as being the same size as that, and this should be much heavier. also this angle here should be much steeper than this one. This one should be, you know, instead of 60, it's down here at 45. Okay? And the reason for that is because everything wants to go up. And unless we want everything to be going up in the whole tree, we leave this as our vent for growth right here. So there's a place for that up determinant to go. But we have to let these guys be, this one has to be the highest or the strongest angle and the strongest wood. The wood here is a little less of an angle and a little bit finer, not as heavy as this one down below. And as you go higher into the tree, this becomes more and more vertical, okay, up at the top. But these ones here, you want these side branches, flatten them down. And you can do that with toothpicks. If they're soft, you know those double-ended toothpicks, you push them in there and you flatten them out. Because you want to slow these down. If you don't, vegetative growth does not bear fruit. If everything is going up and everything is growing like this, it's not going to bear fruit. If you pull it down closer to horizontal, you know, it's higher in the tree. It's going to get nutrients because it's higher in the tree and all those nutrients want to go up. So in order to make sure that you get some fruiting buds in here, you have to flatten that angle a little bit. So the first angle is 60, then 45, then 30, which is flatter. Take your protractor out at home, take a look at what they look like. And then you go almost flat on the top. And yes?
As you flatten the branch, you slow the flow, you slow the oxen flowing out of the lid.
Right.
And you get less growth in that branch.
What's happening is that when you lower it, that oxen that wants to come straight down, it's gravity fed. It goes to the bottom of the branch. Okay? So on the top, there's not as much oxygen to prevent the growth of the buds that are up there. And that way, you get fruit buds setting up on the bottom side, right? You get woody growth or vegetative growth on the top, but you'll get some fruit buds on the bottom. If it's only vegetative, you get no fruit buds. So, yeah, I know, this one gets a little confusing, it does. But this is what you're working with right here. So you start at the bottom because after all they grow, and this is where you're starting. And then as you work up, your wood is lighter and somewhat flatter and shorter. So your longest limbs are here, a little bit shorter here, until you get to the top. And that one in the top, because the vent wants to go up, that one you always cut it back to where the most vigorous growth is, which is going to be in that second third, or in the middle of what grew last year. You cut it. One year you cut it with a bud that's going that way, and then your growth will go that way. The next year you cut it with a bud going that way, and it'll go like this, and you'll end up with something that's kind of like this, but it's still in the middle. So your vent is still in the middle. Does that make sense, or have I lost you? Nope. Okay, you got anything to add, James?
Yeah, and if you do zigzag that at the top, have you ever tried to suck stuff through a bent straw? You know, you're slowing the oxen down. It runs this way slowly, that way. If it's going straight up, it just drops right to the roots. But if you head that way, it slows down on those bends and it produces fruit spurs in there, and you get more fruit. And
Earlier.
Yeah, earlier. And fruit produces oxygen, and it controls the vigor in the tree.
Which means that your tree is not going to grow as big, as fast as when you're doing thinning, because you're maintaining the size much better using this type of growth system. And you can do this with any ornamental tree, okay? The same rules apply. Now here, the peach, you can also use this with cherries and plums. And sometimes on pears, but it's, yeah, most of the time pears are done with a central leader or a modified central leader. So instead of having one whorl of branches on the bottom and then cut it out, which you do for the open center, you might leave 2 or 3 and then cut out the top. So here, this is used for stone fruits. You're using the 4 Bs when you cut it. And this, they bear on 1-year-old wood, or most effectively on 1-year-old wood. So you remove what bore fruit last year, and anything, if there's a lot of extra vegetative growth, you can either thin it out or you can cut it back by half. And that will, you know, give you more growth for next year, which will produce. And this is the one fruit tree that I would say, do it while it's dormant. Because you want that regrowth. Because you want the 1-year-old wood, because that's going to give you your fruit next year. Okay? Apples and pears, they're not fruiting until their 2nd, 3rd, or 4th year. So you don't want to use the open center on them, and you don't want to do the pruning really hard during dormant. So, just to go over all of that, putting it all together, determine your purpose. If you want your tree or shrub to grow like crazy, do your pruning during dormant. If you are actually trying to keep it, you know, maintain size and not let it get too big, remember that when the best pruning times are, either late spring after bud break, or then when the terminal buds have set. And that is not a date, it's a stage. So you check the wood. Choose the appropriate places to cut according to the type of growth that you want. You know, obviously, if you are cutting into 1-year-old wood and you want it to grow gangbusters, then cut it back to the halfway point. You'll get what you want. But most of the time, that's what people don't want. And that's not the growth, the type of thing that you want. And try to remember how those hormones and plant physiology keeps everything in vigor, so that, you know, when you do the central leader tree, you get fruiting throughout the tree. When you have the big old open center tree, all the fruit's on the outside because everything on the inside is shaded. But there's enough light getting into a central leader tree that you have got fruit developing throughout. Those fruiting buds aren't dying. And that's important because we don't have big yards. Most of us don't have big yards. So if you're going to grow a fruit tree, the dwarf and semi-dwarf are a really good route to go. By the way, dwarf trees generally need to have something, they need a friend to lean on, so you need to put in a support. Don't leave them on their own, because the reason that they're dwarfing trees is because it's a fairly wimpy root compared to the rest of the plant, and so you need something to help anchor it, and that's why you use a post or whatever. And of course, on that segue, I completely forgot what I was going to say. So I guess we'll leave it. If any of you have questions, then.
Oh, I do have one quick question. Say you have old trees that you've had and they haven't been pruned in, let's say, because this is really common, you know, people have fruit trees that haven't been pruned in, like, say, 5 or 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
Basically the same thing, hey, like, and don't cut any of the big outside branches, just keep.
Because some of them you should cut.
Yeah, because
you need some renewal.
Yeah.
So take a look at it and see if it's all looking really old, then you're going to have to do some renewal, taking out some of that big wood.
Yeah.
But remember the 1/3.
Yes,
You know,
yes.
if you've got a plant that is that overgrown, you're not going to do it all in 1 year, or you're going to get a huge growth response. Do the limbing this year, you know, take out those big limbs, see what kind of growth response you get in terms of the branching that develops this year, and then you can do a more thorough pruning next year at the proper times. But don't do the dormant, because the dormant is going to get you a big growth response.
Unless you're totally removing big limbs, and then
Yeah, but then you do it,
late spring.
yeah,
you
late
expect
spring
the healing.
or summer, late summer, you know, those are the times, but you don't do it during dormant, because then it takes too long for them to heal.
So like May, start pruning.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
when it's warmed up a bit.
So, you know, if you can see now which ones you should take out,
Yes.
then go and mark them.
Yeah.
Spray paint is the easiest, just
Yeah.
go out there and spray paint them and then you're
Okay.
fine with that.
Okay.
So we had a really weird autumn and fall, winter with apple trees, and we have a young tree with leaves on it.
Yes.
Should we go and
No,
like hand?
they'll push off.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, as soon as the new ones come, they'll push off. And, you know, the only thing is, if you had disease issues last year,
Yeah.
then be scrupulous about cleaning up underneath, because scab and powdery mildew can overwinter.
Yeah.
And you wanna get rid of them.
Yeah.
Okay? And don't put it on the compost heap.
Yeah.
No. Anything else?
Can you spend 2 or 3 minutes just on the espalier?
Oh, on espalier? Okay, what you're doing is you're doing two-dimensional training, right? So rather than having everything coming out from around the tree, you want to grow first off your lower whorl of branches and then develop a central leader that you can then snip and grow a second one, okay? The side branching. Take everything else off. Develop your framework. You're not looking to renew here so much as develop a framework that you will then get your fruit on the side branches. Because that, you know, you've got a permanent framework, and then those little branches that come off of that are gonna give you your fruit. You don't want to prune during dormant. So the best time to prune on your espalier, most of the time, thanks for coming, you guys. Thank you. Best time to prune, at least for formative pruning that is going to keep that plant at a certain size, is with summer pruning. So you wait until the new buds have lignified, the terminal buds, and then you determine what you want to keep and go from there. But basically, you know, you want to take out anything, the 4Ds, anything that is growing like this, anything that's crossing. Keep your framework in mind, but remember you need to have little laterals that are going to give you your fruit. So with the climbing rose, very closely related. So think of the same picture. You've got something that's growing up. If it goes straight up, the only fruit is going to be on the ends where it bends over. If you train it to grow this way, what happens is that all of the hormone balance, those same hormones that we were talking about before, the auxins go to the bottom, and the cytokinins then allow growth on there. You get all these little laterals, and those little laterals on a climbing rose give you your flowers. On a fruit tree, on your espalier, are going to give you the flowers, which then give you the fruit.
Right.
And don't let it bear too heavily. They can bear very heavily because, you know, as they get older, they get a really strong trunk and framework. But yeah, do some blossom thinning so that that way you're going to get a good return crop every year. You're not going to get a heavy crop one year and then nothing the next year. So you blossom thin so that right from the get-go, as soon as those blossoms have been pollinated, they can start growing fruit. If you wait too long, the way that, you know, in traditional orchards, it was usually done when the kids were out of school and the kids went into the orchard and thinned the apples, at that point it's actually too late, you know, because the growth has already been set up. You want to do it within 10 days of bloom.
Okay.
So if you can get in there and blossom thin
Yeah.
right away, then you're going to have, you know, good production every year. Does that help?
That gives me a start.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good luck. Sounds like fun. They're getting to be more fun. And we were in Great Britain last summer, and it's amazing how many espalier trees there are there. You know, people have them in their backyards. They use them as privacy fences.
Yeah, I know, that's what I'm thinking. Looks
Yeah.
great.
It's really cool, and it looks good, and it's producing something.
Yep.
Yeah, using what you have, exactly. Yeah, good luck.
Thank you.
We hope that you certainly learn a lot. Excellent. Thank you very much. Come on, come on, come on.